Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Answering Your Co-Requisite Questions. I know we have more people registered than that are on right now, and it looks like a few people might still be hopping on the call. So let's give them a minute, and then we will get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started because we have a couple of short presentations that we're going to do, and then we're going to hop into a big Q&A session. So if you're just now joining, as I mentioned earlier, this is the Answering Your Co-Requisite Questions webinar. We have partnered, Openstack has partnered with the Charles A. Dana Center at the University of Texas at Austin, as well as the Texas Community College Teachers Association on this webinar. The folks over at the Dana Center really have this incredible expertise and essentially created cowrecks. So we're really lucky to be joined by Connie Richardson and Paula Talley today to share their expertise. So what we're going to do for this webinar is first Connie is going to kick it off with a short presentation. And then I will do a short presentation about OpenStacks and OERs and how those resources can be modified to fit your unique teaching needs. And then we will open it up to a big Q&A. If you've noticed that you've been muted, that is to reduce background noise so we can hear today's speakers. If you have a question, please share it in the questions box because we absolutely do want to hear from you and get as many of your questions answered as possible. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Connie to kick things off.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. So my name is Connie Richardson, and I'm here with my colleague Paula Talley, except that Paula claims that her camera won't work today. And so I'll be doing the presentation. Paula will be communicating with you in the chat and managing questions, answering some questions there, and so on. In the upper right-hand corner, I want you to see that there's a tiny URL that leads to a Dropbox folder. And I know that it's not July 13th that box folder was opened up from the last webinar that we did in conjunction with OpenStax. And so there are some resources from that webinar, and rather than opening up a new box folder, I thought, well, I'll just go ahead and put everything from today in there as well. Take a picture of that so that you have a copy of that tiny URL. Paula will drop it into the chat, and you can take a look at that later. In terms of our expertise with CoRec, Uri Treisman, who's the executive director of the Dana Center, over 30 years ago, he did some really seminal research at Berkeley in terms of how do you support students who are in college level classes but not doing well. And so Peter Adams at Community College of Baltimore County and his colleagues there, Tristan Denley in Tennessee and his colleagues there, they looked at this research. Hunter Boylan, I believe, was involved in some of these early discussions. They looked at Uri's research of how do you support students who are in credit-bearing classes, and they said maybe we can apply that same model to students who have been designated as non-college ready. And that's how this idea of co-requisite supports for Gateway Math and English really took hold in Baltimore County and in Tennessee, Indiana, and then has since spread across the the country. And Paul and I spend a lot of time working with systems, both college and university systems around the country, with their co-requisite implementation. And so really we just are working with Openstacks on these webinars because we've run into a lot of different kinds of implementation. And so we've learned from the field what challenges they've faced and how they've responded to those challenges. And so hopefully some of the things we've learned will be helpful to you here today. So there were some questions that were submitted in advance. Sorry, the box folder, this is what the box folder looks like. And so lots of resources in there. There's a Promoting Equity webinar that the Community College Research Center and the Dana Center partnered on earlier in July. And so if you're interested in thinking about equity in terms of online co-requisites, or even just equity in general, take a look at that webinar. And I think you'll find some really good research-based information there. So pre-submitted questions. One big question, how has COVID-19 changed the way co-recs are taught? So we'll take a look at that. Balancing, what does it look like in the class? Review and preview content, soft skills, hard skills. And then kind of a cluster of questions around being engaging, what materials can you use for building real life projects, what about assessments, and what about this short time frame that we have, and then how can academic libraries best help? So kind of this content, activity, engagement piece. And then finally, what exactly are OERs, which I'll turn it back over to OpenStacks to talk about that when we get there. And then we'll have the free Q&A time after that. So just a few things about how COVID-19 has changed the way co-recs are taught. Well, obviously, many people are online now. Prior to this, there were a lot of institutions that said, we will not do co-requisite online. If students are underprepared, then we need them to come face-to-face. Well, you can't make that kind of distinction anymore, right? It's like, if not being on campus is not safe, then that's the way it is for everybody. So having these be online is very new for some institutions. Associated with that is that because of COVID-19, students need more overall supports, right? They already needed support, and I mean all kinds of support, financial aid, emergency financing, food pantry, clothing closets, all those different kinds, mental health services, all of those supports that students need, and because of COVID, they have less access. So really think about how can you in your class help your students connect to those services. Not that you have to do connections yourselves, but that you can connect them, in your LMS, for example. Make sure that students are aware of, where is the food pantry for your students who are in your local area. Can you put in a connection to the emergency financial support office, those sorts of things. In terms of content, we'd recommend that you avoid computer-based standardized modules. That's been kind of a go-to for some institutions, that it's easy to say, okay, you're going to go over here and you're going to work on these standardized modules, and then you're going to come to statistics, and work on your statistics. What we would suggest, not that you can't use a computer-based model, but if you're using a computer-based model, it needs to be aligned content. So very carefully selecting the content so that it supports what's happening in the gateway course. So rather than just a bunch of random linear equations of all different formats, if I'm in a statistics course, there's some very specific linear equation statistics content that I'm going to need. And so that's what my computer-based instruction, if I'm using it for the CoRec, it should be very closely aligned with what's happening in the upcoming days in the Gateway course. Oh, I see. It looks like my little COVID is covering up part of my line. It didn't look like that on my screen. So recorded micro lectures followed by 1 or 2 questions that make sure that the students are viewing the recorded micro lectures and check for their understanding of the micro lectures. So it's easy to, like I can lecture in class and I can walk around and check how my students are doing and that sort of thing. Obviously, we can't do that as well in an online CoRec. We might be able to use Zoom breakout rooms and drop in the breakout rooms and check on our students, so that's good. But if you have to be completely asynchronous, you really need to think about chunking out your lectures into small pieces. And then having a question or 2 that relates to the lecture. So we're kind of getting into content, and so let's look at some of these other questions that related to content. One of them was, how do you balance the amount of preview and the amount of review that is in a CoRec class? And so I was really glad to see this question, that people are thinking about previewing content, right, rather than reviewing old content. But we would say, roughly, this is just roughly, that maybe you think about a 25 to 75% balance here, that you should have 25% is reviewing what was done in the previous college level course. So, maybe you spend the first, if you're meeting with students synchronously, maybe you spend the first 10 minutes, and that could be online or in a classroom, right? First 10 minutes or so, what questions did you have from last time or from last night's homework? But then 75%, or the bulk of the time, should really be thinking about what's going to happen in that next Gateway course, like I was talking about with the linear equations for statistics. So what's happening in the next Gateway course? What are foundational skills that will support that? For example, reading axes on a XY, coordinate plane. What's some foundational vocabulary? And then also, in the college level content, maybe we do pre-reading of some of the content in the college level course. So in quantitative reasoning, you might be reading passages. In statistics, you might be reading problem sets and starting to identify some new skills and vocabulary, such as population and sample. So practicing with that before it gets introduced in the Gateway course gives those students kind of a leg up. So that would be our recommendation, is that about, the majority of the time you should be looking forward to the next Gateway course meeting, the next class meeting. Another question was about balancing soft skills and hard skills. And there was a question too, I don't think it was necessarily this question, but one of the questions said something about the short time frame we have. And so really, when you're thinking about your CoRec class and how many hours it should be, I know if you're talking about this fall and you're meeting face to face, the number of hours is already set. But for future reference, think about whether you really have put enough hours on there. A lot of people are trying to just add 1 hour of support, and you might be replacing 2 or more developmental classes. So 1 hour support is not going to be sufficient. You need multiple hours of support, and it needs to include the soft skills that were mentioned in this question. So being really explicit with students about learner strategies and psychosocial factors like connectedness and belonging. Part of the reason maybe that they've been designated as needing corequisite support is that they don't have these learner strategies. They have not had the opportunity to develop those. And so being really explicit about that, and kind of embedding some learner strategies within your assignments. If you have some, let's stop and engage in some metacognition and help them develop those metacognition skills. And then, of course, you've got your content objectives, right? That we've still got to deal with those, but students will do a lot better with the content objectives if they've built up these learner strategies, and that'll help them not just with your content objectives, but with the content objectives of the other courses they take for the remainder of their academic career. There was a question about real life project assignments. And so we just, in general, we recommend that you try to incorporate civic and community literacy as much as you can, incorporate financial literacy as much as you can, incorporate risk assessment. There was another question about engagement. And if you think about that, these are all things that students need to be aware of. Oh my goodness, yes, people need to be aware of risk assessment right now, right? Understanding things like false positives, false negatives, depending on your class, you know, can you work in those kinds of contexts? And for real life project assignments, you know, having people like, what city were you born in? Go analyze its budget, and you know, like you have structured questions about analyzing the budget. Environmental projects, the Flint water crisis, oil spills, hurricanes. Some people are dealing with some hurricane aftermath right now, or another one on its way. Journal articles in statistics and QR, journal articles that are related to the student's future career field. Those are all ways that you can incorporate. And I'd be happy to talk about those more later if anybody's interested in that. Or shoot me an email. I'd be happy to discuss some of the projects I've done in the past in more detail. Some other ideas for engagement, interactivity. You might have used Kahoot before. Plickr is a face-to-face where, you know, students, they hold up a barcode that your phone can then scan. I have not used Plickr, but I have heard over and over how easy to use it is and how handy it is. Entry and exit tickets that check for understanding. It starts building in some of that metacognition and those covert learner strategies that we talked about. Paula's may have already dropped in the chat a link to some other ideas like entry and exit tickets and learning logs, again, incorporating metacognition. Group quizzes, when you think about students who are underprepared, they've been told they're not ready for college, you need extra support, they're already feeling like they don't belong, they're already going to have sort of a a mental block that this is not something that they're good at. And so by at the beginning of the semester, having them engage in group quizzes, then it forms group cohesion, right? Like, okay, we're all going to help each other out. And so it helps them do better. It helps them connect to their peers. And then later on in the semester, you can start tapering those off. But it can go a long way at the beginning of the semester to really get students to develop these study groups and get those good study habits and help-seeking behaviors off the ground. So going back to the questions, let's see. Down toward the bottom, how should we include the CoREC content in assessments? I think that's a department decision that you really need to think about. Some places the CoREC and the Gateway course get separate grades. Some places it's just all about what happens in the Gateway. Some places what happens in the CoREC counts for like 10% of the Gateway. So really, I think you have to decide as a department how you want to do that. And when you're thinking about a question in your Gateway course, if you're in math and that question is multi-step, some of that CoREC content is built in the first few steps, right? So if you give partial credit, you're sort of giving CoREC credit, and then the later steps where you're getting into the maybe more of the nitty-gritty of the Gateway content. Academic libraries best helping with CoREC instruction. I'm going to say that basically helping with those projects that I mentioned earlier, helping the instructors know what are the best journals in each of the career fields, giving the students kind of a restricted list of here are 2 or 3 journals for you to choose from in your career field. Those are some things I can think of. And of course, making sure that study locations are available and that sort of thing. I'm sorry, I can't really help a whole lot with that question, but maybe we can get some chat going if we've got a series of librarians on the call. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn this back over. Symphony, are you there?
Yes, thank you so much. I don't know, Paula, did you see any questions in the chat that you felt needed to be answered right away?
There was one question that was asking about, do we have access to free resources that we could use to teach note-taking and building listening skills? Are there examples of that in the box folder?
Okay, note-taking and listening skills?
Yes.
There are not, but how about if I promise by next Monday that we will get some resources in there. So just make a note to yourself to check on Monday, okay?
And that's the only question that popped up.
Okay, great.
Great.
Librarians help each other, please.
And we'll have more time for questions before we end the webinar as well. So I think now at this point, it's a good transition to switch over to talking a little bit about OER and OpenStax. And my colleague Anthony, who is the editorial director of OpenStax, is also on and will probably chime in as well with some additional information. But I'm just going to give a quick overview of OpenStax resources and kind of what OER means and what those resources look like. So what is OpenStax? If you're not familiar with OpenStax or you're kind of new to OpenStax in particular, we are a part of Rice University. We are Rice University's nonprofit ed tech initiative. We were founded by a Rice professor actually back in 1999. He's an electrical engineering professor, Richard Baranook, and in 2012 we started publishing these free openly licensed textbooks that are known as OER. If you've not seen this definition before of open educational resources, it can feel a little bit overwhelming, but it's really helpful, and there's a few ways that you can break this down to make it easier to remember and, kind of guide your understanding of what open educational resources are. Open educational resources are essentially materials of any kind that exist in the public domain, so they can be used by anyone. They usually have no cost to access them or a very, very low cost, and they can be adapted pretty much without restriction. So you can change them and then you can redistribute them to others like your students. That's basically the definition of an open educational resource. So you might be thinking, okay, well, I'm probably familiar with some OERs then, but there's a difference between zero cost and OERs. So your library books, they might not cost you anything to borrow, but they're not OERs. If you think about a library book, I imagine it's not going to go over very well with any librarians. Librarians on the call can probably attest to this. It's not going to go over very well if you decide to rip out a few pages of the book and add some other pages in with your own content. So there's not that open licensing there. Same with things like, TED Talks and other helpful videos on YouTube that you might want to share with your students. or even resources that are built on open educational resources that are built on those openly licensed materials, but then have some other kind of copyright restriction added to them. So OERs really have to have, going back one slide, those, those elements of, being in the public domain, being no cost, and having no or very few restrictions to modifying and then redistributing them. So we hear something like this, or at least, when OpenStax was starting out, we would hear something like this pretty often from instructors. We would hear, I don't have time to build from scratch. I want to start with something that's, good quality. And then if I need to, I want to be able to modify based on what already exists. And so that's kind of how OpenStax came into existence, was trying to fill this need. So OpenStax textbooks are, they're comprehensive, so they fit the standard scope and sequence of the course that they are made for. They're written by various experts in the fields that they are, that their subjects are in. They're peer reviewed. There's a rigorous editorial process. If you have questions on that, Anthony can tell you all about it. And then they get updated regularly as well. And for anyone who's interested in how, when, and why we update our books, I can send a link to a blog post about that. So how do open educational resources like OpenStax books actually help students learn? There's a few different ways, but probably the biggest way that a lot of us think about when we hear something like a free textbook is that it removes a lot of stress from students' lives to having to pay for a textbook. They can then have some mental space freed up to just be able to focus a little bit more on their studies, and it's no longer a barrier to their education. They're not, delaying taking core courses because they can't afford the textbook. So that's one very big way, and a way that probably, the thing that comes to most people's minds when they're thinking about how OERs help students learn. There's also a lot of other benefits to OERs for students. So they're great for multiple semester courses because students never lose access to them. They maintain access, every semester. OpenStax books are always available for students for free. They're not going anywhere. If a student's taking a course that's carrying on throughout the semesters, or maybe if they're taking courses that are building on one another, and they want to just reference past material, that content is still there for them to go back to and revisit. We actually had, I think that's especially important now, because we actually had a student intern who, was kind of advocating to her instructors to use more OER if it were available. And she mentioned that during the pandemic, she felt that she had kind of fallen behind on some things. Like maybe she had finished her classes from the spring, but she had just kind of rushed through and powered through some of that content and her assignments because she had to focus on things at home and, moving off campus and, all these things swirling around in her life that she had to deal with. And she was excited that for her classes that were using OERs, she was going to be able to go back and kind of refresh and look back through the material that she had to rush through before. So you might be thinking, okay, this sounds great for students, but you're also wondering how this can help you as an instructor. And here are a couple of ways that you can be thinking about OERs as being helpful for instructors. All of your students have immediate access to a book like an OpenStax book because it's available for free on the internet. So no one's, falling behind because they couldn't get their textbook in time. Your students are starting off, with all the materials that they need, everyone has the same thing. Let's see, sorry about that. It also gives you ownership of the content. You know, you're not having to worry about things suddenly disappearing. You also, probably the biggest one and the thing that would be most helpful going into this new school year is that you have the freedom to change the content. Like I mentioned earlier in defining what OER actually is. We had this great webinar, and I can add the link to the recording of that. We had this great webinar as part of our Creator Fest 2020 online virtual event, where a few instructors talked about their experiences with modifying OER. They talked about, you know, doing this to fit the unique needs of their students. They talked about doing it for, you know, curriculum needs in their state. What's great is that with OER is that you can really focus in on what your student population is, what's relevant to them, and the skills that they need, and then adjust your book essentially to fit that. But at the same time, with something like OpenStax, you're going to have this comprehensive thing that already exists, and then you can just build on it or, you know, swap things out here and there. I think this would be a good time if Anthony has anything to chime in on. But since we're talking about math, I have put up here the books that we currently have for math, as well as what we're going to have soon for corequisite courses in particular. And I can see Anthony turned his audio on, so I didn't know if he wanted to say anything.
Sure. Thanks so much, Symphony, and everybody. Great stuff. And I think, you know, just kind of capitalizing on what Symphony said, we think that in math, the freedom allowed by OER is one of the, you know, is a great and powerful freedom, you know, more than in other disciplines. We hear very often that in other areas, you know, well, we'll combine American government and U.S. history, and that sometimes happens, or bio and chemistry. But in math, with all the interchangeability, the skills development that needs to be created, OER provides a lot of flexibility. And we've seen, before we started on our corequisite books, we saw faculty doing corequisites. That was beyond the you know, the proven benefits of the methodology and the needs that it serves among students. We saw that many of our faculty were taking elements of our, you know, intermediate algebra book and inserting them into our college algebra book, or you know, vice versa, with you know, and doing it on their own using our customization system or their own, or with, you know, a learning management system, and so on. And regarding the math, we'll provide these corequisite support versions of the textbooks, which have integrated foundational content, you know, skills building material within the textbook. We'll also provide those materials as separate items, even as Word documents, so that you know, it's not just about using material in OpenStax, it's just about using material. So you can use and customize what we provide in any way. You can take it, download it, put it into your system, or again, if we provide something via Word doc or Google Doc, you know, you can go ahead and edit as you'd like. So right, so here, just briefly on what we're offering regarding coreqs, as a foundation to use the great methodologies and technologies that you know, that the team from the Dana Center was talking about. The textbooks are if you're not familiar with OpenStax College Algebra, for example, just as a brief, it takes you through the major principles of college algebra, you know, functions, all the way through to, you know, analytic geometry and so on. And what we've done is Sharon North and her team from St. Louis Community College have developed skill sheets that sort of go ahead of each section of college algebra. She and her team have mapped the most important skills and considered also how things flow. You know, if you already saw something when you're in chapter 7, you know, what do you do with it, that same concept or skill, when you get to it in chapter 10? So they thought a lot about that in terms of the mapping, and so how we can build a cumulative understanding without overwhelming students, and create good balance there. But the way it works logistically is that at the beginning of every section of college algebra, there is a new co-requisite skills subsection, which includes, in most cases, an explanation, learning objectives, and an explanation of what the concept is, examples, practice problems, some guided examples, and so on. And then it ends up with a series of additional practice problems so that students can make sure they're ready for the upcoming college algebra section. These materials could be done in any really way you want. They could be assigned as a separate item. They could be done independently by the students. They could be done as group work in a co-requisite classroom or webinar breakout group, however you're delivering your this semester, and so on. And again, they will be available both inside the textbook and then as downloadable separately numbered and objects that you can take and then use however you'd like. Sharon has also very generously provided different types of co-requisite resources that we're calling labs. They're more intensive and probably better suited for group work. There's a little less instruction along the way, although there is some, and it's more outcomes based. Those will not be integrated into the textbooks themselves. That would be a lot of content to integrate into the textbook, but they will be put alongside as downloadable items that you can use again, and they could be distributed to students. They could be printed out, however anybody wants to use, and then used independently or under your facilitation. I'll stop there, and I'll just say that eventually the other place for these materials will be in LMS cartridges. So we'll distribute them there, and then a number of our ecosystem partners that we work with, WebAssign, XYZ, Newton, will be incorporating these as well into their offerings. And I think what's important there is that taking all of that and then considering, okay, now that I have these materials, can that be a good resource for me to use the techniques around better co-requisite instruction, and building equity and using even other innovative technologies, Plickers and Kahoots and things like that, just using these pieces of content as sort of fuel. That's the point of the OER, is that you can use them in any way you want, and then and even just pieces of them that fit your situation and your students. So thanks very much, and again, we'll be very glad to answer any questions you have, and we'll start to distribute these over the next month or so.
Thank you, Anthony, for chiming in there. I just have one last little slide, and that's in case you are curious about, additional resources around OERs and things that you can pair with Openstack books. I've put a few things up here. We've been doing a series on our blog about online teaching, and the series is based on some webinars that we partnered with ACU, the Association for College and University Educators. So you can go there to check out things around online teaching, as well as just some other helpful information about getting the most out of open educational resources. You can go to openstacks.org/partners to search for different technology options to use in your course. The OER Commons is also a great repository of lots of instructor created resources, and then I put the link for AQ as well, and I will put all these links in the chat so that you can just click directly on them. AQ has a ton of great content and just helpful information about many things, but a ton of stuff that they've been doing recently, trying to help instructors get through this period with the pandemic. And with that, that's pretty much everything that I had to share up front, but I can see that we have some questions coming in, so maybe we can start addressing those together. Let's see. So, looks like someone's asking, these additional resources will be seen and accessible through the OpenStack's website. where we find the textbooks. Yes, so all of the stuff that Anthony and I were just talking about, that is going to be available on the OpenStack's website, and I can, I'll put a link right now actually in the chat to where you can preview the college algebra with corequisite support book before it fully publishes later this month. Okay. Let's see. Someone asked earlier if the PowerPoints would be sent, and I don't know, Connie and Paula, if you were planning to share your presentations, but we'll definitely share a recording of the webinar.
Yeah, as soon as I put the box folder link up on the screen, I thought I didn't put the PowerPoint in there, but I'll do that as soon as we get off the line. I'll put the slides in there, and then that way you'll have access to my email, Paula's email, and if you want to put, I mean, we could put the recording in there too if you want to share. I mean, I can add you, Symphony, as an owner, and you can add the recording, and however you want to do it, so that it's all in one place.
Yeah, that works. We can definitely do that. Let's see. If you have a question and you haven't yet shared it, just go ahead and share it in the questions box, since that's what we're monitoring right now. Let's see. Someone asked if there's an OpenStack's Applied Calculus textbook. Not as of now.
But if you'd like to write one.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, great. Gail says that her department is excited to use OER to help students financially this fall. Let's see. I'm going
That was
to...
a pretty startling statistic, 28 hours at minimum wage to buy one $200 book.
Yeah, yeah. It's not easy for students. And I think now especially we've seen, you know, students who have maybe been laid off, you know, because of the economic downturn that's come with the pandemic. It's becoming, the savings is becoming ever more important.
If we don't have a question that's come in, I would like to say something that I saw this morning, some research that came out maybe through Inside Higher Ed, publishing, you know, like doing one of their little summaries of some research. And it was something like 41.8% of students seeking mental health services, and over half of them reporting that access to those services was much more difficult than before the pandemic. And so just as your students are coming back, we've all talked about it on these webinars about the stress that faculty are under, the stress that students are under, but just keeping that in mind. And when I was talking about supports, thinking about, you know, is there a way that you can make sure that you incorporate either into your LMS or into some of your communications with students, a reminder about your mental health services?
That is an important reminder. Thank you. Let's see, it looks like someone's asking, do we have any resources available for computer technology? And I'm not sure if this question means, you know, what kind of technology is available for corecs and, you know, teaching them, and, you know, online homework or courseware for these classes. I'll put the link for OpenStack's Tech Scout, which lets people search for technologies. But Connie, if you have any, I know you mentioned things like Kahoot and other tech that can support these courses and make them a little bit more engaging. Do you have anything else to share or expand on there?
Paula, can you think of anything else that you'd add to that?
I have to apologize. I was trying to find an Inside Higher Ed link for you to post besides the webinar. I'm trying to contribute to the chat. So I'm gonna be upfront and honest. Will you repeat that question, please? Being that student in the class who's multitasking.
Go ahead, Symphony.
Yeah, so the question is if you have any additional ideas to share around using technology in corecs, whether they're online or in person, to further support, you know, student engagement in the course. We've definitely seen a lot more people looking for technology, you know, as they teach through the pandemic, whether that's just to, you know, make sure their students are hopping online and connecting, or if they want to ensure deeper engagement because they're not in front of their students and able to, you know, see how engaged they are when they're going through the content. So if you have any other ideas around that.
Right. So I'm actually teaching a course online right now, and something to consider during this pandemic is many students signed up for online that wouldn't normally be your online students. So when you're thinking about the technology, be careful to note that many of your students are actually working from cell phones and other pieces. So you need to make sure that technology is compatible. I have tried to keep it simple for the students, at least for this summer. I've just used the tools and breakout rooms and used some formative assessment techniques. And, you know, if I want to show a graph, you might want to bring up Desmos or something like that. But from my understanding, there's even some issues with accessibility with Desmos. And we use the LMS to do a lot of stuff. So I've tried to keep it extremely simple this summer, you know, considering the student population that's online who normally wouldn't be online. But others in the audience, you're probably doing some, you know, great things too. I'm going to put a link in the chat. I think it was an Inside Higher Ed. I can't guarantee if this is updated, but it shows a lot of teaching online tools, and it tells you they're free or if there's cost to them, and it tells you the benefits of using the advantages of them. But I have to be honest, I don't know who keeps this up to date. So I'm posting that right now, but I know you can't post in the chat, but if you have, oh, I posted the wrong spot. If you have some ideas, you can post in the questions boxes about some ideas you're using in your classes.
And I would just kind of add to Paula's point about keeping it simple, that if you do pull in 2 or 3 apps and technologies, and then their other 4 instructors are also pulling in 2 or 3 different, you know, apps and technologies, that can quickly add to the student's cognitive load, to where it's more about how can I learn all of these different technologies than it is how can I learn the content that I'm supposed to learn. So, you know, maybe figuring out kind of what's kind of common on your campus. In fact, and what we learned in some of our interactions with faculty this summer is that many campuses have restrictions on what you can use. And in the spring, a lot of faculty who hadn't taught online before did not know that. And they were bringing in a lot of technologies that they really weren't supposed to be using. So be sure you check with your campus. Is there a list of approved technologies? And you know, make sure you don't go outside of that. And then that way, if everybody on campus is abiding by that list, then that reduces it puts the cognitive load on the student where you want it to be, which is on your content.
That is a great point, that we, you know, they probably don't want to overload students with too many technologies, and then they're spending, you know, the time that you'd want them spending learning the content on learning how to navigate the different platforms and websites that they're on. With that, actually, we have a couple of questions that have come in about LMS integration. And LMS integration can be great in having, you know, maintaining this one home base for all of your content. And I don't know if Anthony wants to chime in here, but I will share my screen. and show how to see the options for LMS integration with Openstack Textbooks. Let's see. So if you're looking for to integrate an Openstack textbook with your LMS, all you need to do is navigate to the book that you are using. So let's just use college algebra as an example here. You'll want to go to the instructor resources tab. And then right here at the top, right now, we have course cartridges for this book that are available for Canvas and for Blackboard, depending on which LMS you're using. We're adding more over time for the different LMS options. We know there are more. Oh, and you'll definitely want to make sure that you are logged in to your free instructor account to be able to do this and to access the other instructor resources. Anthony, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And yeah, so just like Symphony's saying, we'll have posted Canvas, Blackboard. We'll add D2L and Moodle cartridges. I should just note, just for expectation setting, these are mostly, links to the textbook and sort of soft resources. They're not, these cartridges that we're distributing here are not, cohesive, methodological like sort of courseware, and they don't include, automatic grading or anything like that. For that type of resource, beyond building it in yourself, we would recommend, using either a service or an ecosystem partner that can provide something like online homework. So in terms of LMS integration, we have the baseline cartridges that Symphony's showing. LMS integration can also occur through the use of a homework platform, WebAssign, XYZ, Newton, others, and that will then integrate itself into the LMS. And finally, we encourage a lot of partnership and, of course, connection with your IT, admin, or instructional support, CTE departments when using these. In most cases, if it's not clear, when you download one of these cartridges or make some sort of connection with one of the ecosystem partners, you will need to involve your IT group unless you have admin rights. Most faculty do not. So getting a course shell created and a course instance created in the LMS environment, potentially uploading a cartridge or making some sort of LTI, some sort of connection between a third party and your system. Most of that is done in concert with the IT department, as you probably know. But these cartridges are built for that type of use case as well.
Thanks, Anthony. Let's see, I think those are all of the questions that we've had come in so far. If anyone wants to throw any last questions in, we do still have a few minutes left, but we're nearing the end of the webinar as it is. Connie, Paula, did you have anything else that you wanted to add or share?
I was just going to say that Paula was looking for the link to that mental health article that I mentioned, but I'll drop it in the box folder so that everybody will have it.
Yes, and thank you so much for putting together that folder. That's like a very special treat that we don't always get to have on as a resource added to these webinars. So thank you for putting that together. That's very, very, very helpful.
Sure.
And let's see, I don't think we have any other questions. It looks like, Anthony, someone's asking about Moodle, so I'm just gonna see if I can connect the two of you on that. I'm not sure if we are.
We will. I could answer that. We will eventually have Moodle cartridges for all of our books. We have them for some right now, and we'll be adding those in the next probably in the next month.
Thank you.
But of course, if there's any other conversation or you want to learn more about it or anything like that, yeah, please definitely let's talk.
Okay, great. And then one last question that looks like it came in is, how do I see the box folder. Paula has added it. It's the tiny URL that she added into the chat. So make sure you look at the chat and you can click the link and it'll appear magically for you if you haven't seen that yet. And I think with that, oh, thank you. Also, a few people are chiming in to say that thank you, this was really helpful. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to us. I think Connie shared hers and Paula's emails at the beginning. You can contact OpenStacks at support@openstacks.org, or you can just reply to the email notification you got to join this webinar. And I'll be able to see those as they come through and field them to the relevant people within the OpenStacks team. And thank you to our hosts for great presentations today. Anthony, for chiming in. I think with that, we can go ahead and end today's webinar.